I'm going to start actually with a story that I think is an event that was very key in causing some of the things that have happened in recent years, especially in the last decade, the last 5 years, especially in the last year, and actually especially in the last week. Things are just happening at an accelerating pace in the Church of Scientology. So first thing you need to know is that Scientology has a set of teachings that are available to the public, and then it has a set of what are called advanced teachings, which are reserved to the privileged few who have paid money and had the required prerequisite teachings. Those are known as the advanced teachings. Those advanced teachings are only kept in a few advanced orgs, they're called, in Scientology. Those are located in Los Angeles, California, in Clearwater, Florida, in St. Hill, UK, and in Copenhagen, Denmark, which is the smallest of the advanced orgs. And that's actually pictured here. That's the Copenhagen, Denmark advanced org. What happened in December of 1983 is that two Scientologists dressed in Sea Org uniforms, looks like U.S. Navy uniforms, came into the org and said, "We demand to immediately see the head of the organization. You are out ethics. You have problems going on here. We need to see your advanced teachings." They were escorted to a conference room, and no one really thought this was suspicious because it's a very common event in Scientology for two Sea Org officers on a mission to show up on your org and tell you all the things that you're doing wrong. So these two Scientologists went into a conference room, were presented with copies of the advanced materials. They looked through them. They put 2 copies into a briefcase, and they walked out the door. And you can probably guess the punchline to the story of the 2 Scientologists walking into the advanced org. But they were not associated with the Church of Scientology. They were Scientologists who had left the church and were trying to set up their own competing breakaway organization. And they're what Scientology calls squirrels. Squirrels are people who are practicing Scientology without the proper authority of the Church of Scientology. So this event back in 1983 led to an attempt to set up some competing Scientology organizations. These individuals were also affiliated with L. Ron Hubbard's former auditor in Santa Barbara, who had an organization called the Advanced Ability Organization. And Scientology's response was basically a couple of these guys got thrown in jail for a little while, but the secrets that they took were not recovered. But this was kind of the first loss of control over Scientology's secret teachings that we'll see repeated again and again over time. And it's interesting to compare the attempts to form breakaway organizations in the mid-'80s were not terribly successful. They've been a lot more successful recently, and I think part of the reason is the same reason that protests against abuse by Catholic priests were somewhat ineffective in 1992, but then in 2002, the Survivors Network of those abused by priests took off and had ended up with tens of thousands of members. So to understand Scientology, you need to understand that there are at least 3 different kinds of experience in Scientology depending on your relationship to the church. So first of all are what are called public Scientologists. Those are people who have a regular full-time job outside of the Church of Scientology. They are people that are customers of the Church of Scientology. They're taking courses, but they still have some kind of a life outside. And Scientology sees them as a good source of income. Second is the celebrities. Scientology has specifically solicited celebrities since 1955 and had special celebrity centers that give them their own very carefully presented version of Scientology. And they get a very good experience with Scientology, and on some occasions get cheap labor from the Church of Scientology. And then finally, staff. People that are on staff in Scientology are the people who have all the horror stories of abuse inside the organization. They're the ones that work long hours for either no pay as volunteers or at very low rates of pay as full-time employees. But then I want to go back to how this all got started, because L. Ron Hubbard, who was born in Tilden, Nebraska in 1911, he was the son of a U.S. naval officer, and the Church of Scientology says that Hubbard himself claimed to be an explorer, a military hero, a mystic, blood brother of the Blackfeet Indians, a philosopher, a nuclear physicist, and an expert on human nature, but he was actually none of those things that I just listed. He was, however, an adventurer. He was a pulp fiction writer who wrote a large amount of fiction, and he was a teller of tall tales even from his early childhood. One of the things Scientology likes to claim about him is that he was the youngest Eagle Scout ever. The Boy Scouts of America actually keeps no record of who was the youngest Eagle Scout, but he was, in fact, an Eagle Scout at the age of 13. But he was also a college dropout. He was a bigamist. He was convicted of petty theft and fraud, and he was named as an unindicted co-conspirator in a federal case that sent 11 Scientologists to prison. And he built a religious empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars, most likely over $1 billion today. And his writings are now etched in metal and buried in vaults in various places in the desert around the world. So future generations, even if there's a nuclear holocaust, the writings of L. Ron Hubbard will be preserved. Just a few examples to point out the flaws in his claims. So for example, he claimed to be a military hero. This is an example of a...
Could you speak a little louder?
Yes, an example of a review of his conduct basically says that he acts without forethought as to probable results. He is believed to have been sincere in his efforts to make his ship efficient and ready, not considered qualified for command or promotion at this time, recommend duty on a large vessel where he can be properly supervised. So Hubbard did end up with command of his own vessel during World War II briefly, but he didn't actually see any real action, although he did file a report claiming that he had an encounter with a German U-boat and shelled it. He actually ended up shelling the Coronado Islands, which belonged to Mexico, which was neutral in World War II. He claimed to be a nuclear physicist. He did actually take a course in nuclear physics at George Washington University. The document, it's probably too small for you to read, but it basically says right here, Lafayette Ronald Hubbard has never received any degree whatsoever from the George Washington University. He spent a few semesters at George Washington University. We have his report cards. So we know that he got a D average and flunked nuclear physics. Actually, yeah, there's his F. I really like this picture. It's a little bit unclear, but this is L. Ron Hubbard auditing a tomato plant. Yes, this is a picture of L. Ron Hubbard auditing a tomato plant. And I think I like this picture for a couple reasons. One, because it's funny. But second, because it illustrates Hubbard's methods of how he accumulated things from the popular culture and made them part of Scientology or Dianetics doctrine. This is a story where I tried to trace it back a little bit further. Where did this idea of plants screaming with pain come from? The earliest thing that I found is a New Yorker story in 1949 by Roald Dahl, the author of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory and James and the Giant Peach. He wrote a story in the New Yorker called The Sound Machine, in which the premise was that a scientist builds a machine and suddenly finds that trees scream out when they're being chopped down, lawns shriek with pain when they get mowed, and things like that. Actually, a recent 14 Times actually has traced it back even further than that. So where did Dianetics come in? Dianetics was first published in Astounding Science Fiction magazine in May 1950. The book Dianetics came out the same month, and the Hubbard Dianetic Research Foundation was actually founded the month before in April in Elizabeth, New Jersey. But Hubbard, well, let's see, the principles of Dianetics, and Dianetics basically means through the mind. Hubbard claimed that Dianetics was the new science of mental health that would be a replacement for other forms of psychological therapy. And he initially gave credit to other people for aspects of what he claimed, and there are all sorts of things that he pulled from popular culture. So he took things from Norman Vincent Peale's Power of Positive Thinking, from Alfred Korzybski's 1933 book, Science and Sanity, and from Aleister Crowley. And I'm not going to talk about it, but I'll just make reference to the fact that Hubbard briefly spent some time with Jack Parsons, who is the founder of Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and was also a follower of Aleister Crowley, and they did some occult rituals together. And some of the elements of Crowley's beliefs have been incorporated into Scientology. But subsequently, Hubbard claimed that that it all came to him from out of the blue, and that it was a wholly original creation. But that's true of almost nothing that he actually did. So Dianetics claims that all of our problems are caused by bad experiences that we have that are encoded as engrams in our unconscious or reactive mind. And the goal of Dianetics is to identify those engrams through a process of auditing, which just you and a friend with a copy of the book Dianetics can do. So by reliving some of these experiences and then eliminating the bad experiences, you can eliminate the engrams, eliminate your reactive mind entirely, and become what's called a clear. The state of clear is someone whose mind is now just their rational, analytic mind, and their unconscious, reactive mind has been dissolved. So the Hubbard Dianetic Research Foundation was founded in April 1950, but Hubbard liked to spend money faster than he was bringing it in. So by February of 1952, less than 2 years later, the organization was bankrupt. And the board of directors, over Hubbard's objections, filed for bankruptcy. The assets of the organization were purchased by a member of the board, Don Purcell, who was a real estate magnate in Wichita, Kansas. So in just 2 short years, Hubbard had created Dianetics, had a best-selling book about it, and then lost the intellectual property to a former partner. So in May of 1952, Hubbard moved to Phoenix, Arizona, and decided to start over again. So he lived in this house, which is currently a museum owned by the Church of Scientology near their new Ideal Org. So here in Phoenix, Hubbard created Scientology, which basically incorporated Dianetics, but also took it a step further. So Scientology takes you from the step of clear, recognizes that you are a spiritual being called a thetan, and that but through Scientology and the things that Scientology courses do for you, you can achieve states of operating thetan, which at present are operating thetan levels 1 through 8. But he didn't stay in Phoenix for very long. He moved on to Washington, D.C. in July of 1955, where the founding Church of Scientology is just off DuPont on 19th Street. It's called the Founding Church of Scientology because it was the first actual building purchased. It was actually the third corporation, with the 2 prior corporations being the Church of Scientology of California and of Arizona. In the picture here, this is the Fraser Mansion. This is a little tent that was set up next to it a few years ago, and basically says something can be done about it. And these little flyers are being handed out that say if you're tired and your feet are hurting and so forth, there's something that can be done about it. What you don't see mentioned is Scientology, but what they do, if you take them up on it, is what's called a touch assist, which has some resemblance to therapeutic touch. It basically involves a Scientologist taking their finger and pointing at you and saying various things. So does it hurt here, and so on, and then that's it. And assist complete, and then you get better. In 1959, Hubbard moved to England, where he bought the former home of the Maharaja of Jaipur, St. Hill Manor in East Sussex. Hubbard sometimes claimed that he won the estate in a poker game with the Maharaja, but that's not true. But he lived there from 1959 to 1967. That's where he did his tomato plant auditing. But in 1967, he had the itch to go out and do some exploring and adventuring. So in 1967, he bought a boat called the Enchanter and went off to the island of Las Palmas, which turns out to be a key location in Scientology. He ended up purchasing 2 more ships, the Avon River and the Royal Scotsman, which was renamed the Apollo. And on the ship, there were some jazz musicians that he worked with and put out this album here called Power of Source by the Apollo Stars. Not a very happy looking crowd there. One interesting point here, that this woman here, her name is Annie Tidman, later known as Annie Broker, and she'll become important a little bit later. This is actually a 1974 jazz album that was recorded in a movie theater in Portugal, and it's widely regarded as absolutely awful. I've not tried listening to it, but it is available online. So this is a piece of Operating Thetan 3 in Hubbard's own handwriting, and this is an interesting document because this is something that Scientologists will regularly deny is part of Scientology. This is really Scientology's cosmology and story of what the upper levels in Scientology means, why you need to go beyond clear and do additional auditing, and basically the cause is, it sounds like science fiction, but it says the head of the Galactic Confederation, 76 planets around larger stars visible from here, founded 95 million years ago, very space opera, solved their overpopulation problem, 250 billion or so people per planet, by mass implanting. He, meaning the galactic overlord Xenu, caused people to be brought to Tigiak, also known as Earth, and put an H-bomb on the principal volcanoes, Incident 2. So basically what this says is that to solve the overpopulation problem, the evil galactic warlord Xenu put people onto space planes that looked exactly like DC-9s, flew them to Earth, dropped them in volcanoes in Hawaii and Las Palmas, blew them up with H-bombs, and the dead bodies of murdered space aliens then sort of filtered over the surface of the Earth and attached themselves to the other Thetans present. And what you find out at OT level 3 is that your auditing is not only to deal with your own engrams, it's to deal with the engrams of the murdered space aliens that are attached to you, known as body Thetans. So for some reason, Scientology doesn't want you to know this until you've already gone through all the steps to clear and OT 1 and 2 and paid lots of money and have sufficient cognitive dissonance that you can't admit that you were duped by such a thing. Yeah, this is an example of denial. This is an interaction between Kurt Loder and Lisa Goodman, who was the media PR person for the Church of Scientology in 1995 on an MTV special on cults. So Loder says, I understand there's a galactic overlord Xenu. Is there a whole staff of characters, or is that not true? And her response is basically, I don't really know what you mean. I don't know what you're talking about. When John Sweeney of the BBC did a show on Panorama called Scientology and Me in 2007, he got similar denials from Tommy Davis, Kirstie Alley, Ann Archer, and Juliette Lewis. They all said, I have no idea what you're talking about, never heard of Xenu. But every person I just named, with the exception of Tommy Davis, had already been through this, so they knew that this story was true. And there seems to be, ex-Scientologists are much more willing to talk about it and admit that yes, this is real, but current Scientologists will almost universally deny it and say that they just don't even want to talk about it. Part of the reason is that it's Scientology doctrine that if you are exposed to that story without the proper preparations, which I assume is true of most of the people in the audience, you can catch pneumonia and die. And I am sorry to have exposed you to that. After a number of years at sea and going from port to port, being kicked out of country after country, Hubbard decided it was time to go ashore again, and he did that by having some shell companies purchase expensive pieces of property in Clearwater, Florida, downtown Clearwater, starting with the Fort Harrison Hotel, which is pictured on the left. These are a couple of people in Sea Org uniforms walking around. The building on the right here is across the street from the Fort Harrison Hotel. It's what's known as the Superpower Building. Scientology has been building it for the better part of a decade. It's still not open to the public. They've spent at least $24 million on it so far, and they've raised over $140 million to build it. And it's a place where Scientologists will be able to pay $1,000 an hour for experiences with strange contraptions like an oiliness table, a smell wall, and a pain table, which doesn't sound like fun. Scientology also acquired a number of properties in Los Angeles at about this time, and actually a little bit earlier. This is the Celebrity Center in Hollywood. Former hotel built in the 1920s for celebrities, and it's still for celebrities, but now for Scientology celebrities. And I have to give Scientology credit for actually saving this building. This building was slated for demolition in the late 60s, early 70s. Scientology bought it for $1.5 million in 1973 when it was slated for demolition. It's now worth $75 million today. This is a building known as Big Blue or Pac Base. It's a former Cedars of Lebanon hospital in Los Angeles, also known as the Complex. Many of the Sea Org staff live in this building. It's also the home of Scientology's IT organization. And this was the third of at least 5 or 6 large properties that Scientology has purchased in the Hollywood area. Most of these buildings are exempt or partially exempt from property taxes. Just for reference, the sign here, those letters are 16 feet high with LEDs, and just that sign itself cost $500,000. A question often comes up about this cross. What's with the cross? In the 1960s, Hubbard was having battles over tax exemption, and sent out a policy letter that said we need to basically adopt some trappings of religion, including priests' collars, and there must be a cross in every org. This cross is actually very similar to Aleister Crowley's Rosy Cross. It's basically a cross with these little spikes on it. And then this is another expensive piece of real estate. This is the Church of Scientology in New York City, just off of Times Square, across the street from the Marriott Marquis Hotel. They've had this since the late 70s. This is not a tax-exempt property, and despite multiple fights with the state of New York over that. So Scientology is well known for a number of abuses, most prominently being very litigious against people that criticize them. But their troubles started at least way back in 1963 when the FDA raided and seized their e-meters because of Scientology making medical claims about those. So a label was put on all e-meters as part of the settlement with the FDA. The first sentence of the label on the e-meter says something to the effect of, this device by itself does nothing. And it's essentially, electronically, it's essentially a Wheatstone bridge. It's basically measuring, it's like a skin galvanometer, basically. But it's a key component of auditing. Although Dianetics was originally intended to allow any 2 people with a copy of the book to do all the auditing they needed, Hubbard professionalized it and created certifications for auditing and created e-meters that you need to buy to do your auditing with. Another thing that happened was in 1966, in order to combat critics, the Church of Scientology created something called the Guardian Office, also known as Division 20 in Scientology's org chart. that organization was basically responsible for all these operations that are listed here. So people who were in the Guardian office said they were basically playing spy a lot and digging up dirt on critics, running these operations against critics. These first two operations, the first two operations, Operation Daniel and Operation Dynamite in 1972, were against the author Paulette Cooper. Paulette Cooper was a travel writer who first wrote an article for a UK magazine in 1969 about Scientology, and then she turned it into a book called The Scandal of Scientology, which was published in 1972, or 71. That book, by today's standards, is actually pretty mild in its criticism, and it seems like she tries to bend over backwards to say positive things about Scientology. She actually went through low-level courses to experience it for herself and reported on what her experiences were. But Scientology pulled out all the stops, and those two projects involved trying to expose her, dig up dirt on her sex life and expose it to the public. They put her name and phone number on walls to try to get obscene phone calls made to her. And then Operation Dynamite took things up a level. They stole stationery from her home by having someone pose as a solicitor for United Farm Workers, and they forged bomb threats against the New York City org of Scientology in her name. She was arrested. She was thrown in jail. Eventually, the charges were dropped, but it kind of hung over her for years, and it wasn't until 1977 that the FBI discovered that Scientology had actually been behind the whole thing. During that period of time when she was fighting the criminal charges, she was she had a relationship that broke up, and she was befriended by a guy named Jerry Levin. And Jerry Levin ended up becoming her platonic roommate. And she found out in 1977, or subsequently, that he was actually a Scientologist who was reporting back everything that she was thinking and saying on a daily basis. Let's see, Operation Freakout I mentioned was also against Paulette Cooper. The intent of that operation, which was not actually carried out, was to get her either committed to a mental institution or thrown in prison for a felony. And again, they went with the forging bomb threats route. But this time, rather than having Scientology as the target, they decided that Middle Eastern embassies should be the target. So they had someone who was going to impersonate her voice and make threatening phone calls, as well as do the bomb threats on paper again as well. The reason it didn't happen is because this here, Operation Snow White, which lasted at least from 1973 to 1976, went bad for them. Operation Snow White was intended to infiltrate U.S. government offices, find out what they were collecting about Scientology, and correct the record or destroy the record. So a couple of guys got, actually more than two people, but several people got jobs, low-level jobs in government offices. Two guys in particular, Gerald Wolfe and Michael Meisner, got clerk typist jobs with the IRS. And then they were infiltrating other offices, including the Coast Guard Intelligence Agency, the DEA, and the DOJ. Wolfe and Meisner got caught in a DOJ attorney's office in 1975 or 1976, and the connection to Scientology wasn't discovered until about 30 days later. But that kicked off an FBI investigation, which led to raids on the D.C. org and the Los Angeles org in 1977. And that ultimately led to 11 Scientologists being sent to prison, including Mary Sue Hubbard, L. Ron Hubbard's wife, who spent 2 years in jail. Hubbard himself, along with attorney Kendrick Moxon, were named as unindicted co-conspirators, who were not actually prosecuted as part of the settlement. But when this all went down, Hubbard basically went into hiding and stayed in hiding for the rest of his life. A couple more on here. Operation Speedy Gonzales was directed at the mayor of Clearwater, Florida, an attempt to set him up with a staged hit-and-run accident, which didn't work. And then Operation Humanist Humiliation, I include that one because that was actually targeted at the Committee for the Scientific Investigation of Claims of the Paranormal, now known as the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry. The purpose of that operation, which I don't know if anything was actually done, but the purpose was to try to make people believe that PsyCop was a CIA front group. And then ultimately, after the legal case and top 11 Scientologists being sent to prison, the Guardian office was closed in 1983, and the official story by Scientology is that we got rid of all those bad people, we reformed the organization, and we don't do that stuff anymore. We're a very highly ethical organization. But when the Guardian office was closed down, something else was created called the Office of Special Affairs. And you recall I told you that the Guardian office was also known as Division 20. The Office of Special Affairs is Division 20. So there's just a whole bunch of policies in Scientology that are associated with claims of abuse. Lawsuits, of course. The fair game policy I'll talk about more shortly. Dead agenting, which is the idea that you discredit your critics by collecting dirt on them and publishing it and making them into a dead agent. Disconnection, which is a very common cult practice to require that people no longer have associations with people outside of the organization who are problems. Baby watch, which I'll tell you more about shortly, that's basically a treatment for people that have psychotic breaks while undergoing Scientology treatment. The idea that homosexuality is low-toned. Scientology has something called the tone scale, and the higher you are on the tone scale, the better. So being happy and satisfied are things at the top. Being angry and upset are low, and also down low is being homosexual. Knowledge reports, which Scientologists are encouraged to file knowledge reports on other people that are causing problems. Pressure for abortion, especially in the Sea Org. People report that they've been pressured to have abortions. The Rehabilitation Project Force, which is if you do something wrong in Scientology and get assigned bad status, you can get put on the Rehabilitation Project Force, where you're forced to wear overalls, have a dirty rag tied around your arm so that everyone knows that you're in the RPF. You're not allowed to speak to anyone else. You have to run from one place to another. You do hard physical labor, and then ultimately you improve your statistics and are able to get off of the RPF. Oops, pressing the wrong button. The whole, I'll say more about later. Touch Assist, I've already mentioned. The Purification Rundown is part of their drug treatment program, which involves niacin injections and sitting in a sauna. Scientology has a program called Narcanon, which I won't talk about, but I can answer questions about it. Xenu already mentioned. And the doctrine of exchange I mentioned because it's one that most Scientologists don't know about themselves. And that's because the doctrine of exchange is a doctrine that was important for Scientology's legal case with the IRS. The idea is that the reason that people have to make donations to the Church of Scientology in response to the services they receive is because of this doctrine of exchange, that you can't accept a gift or give a gift without there being some kind of compensating exchange in the other direction. And this is an example of some sections from Hubbard Communications Office policy letters. Hubbard wrote tons of these policy letters, which were printed in either red or green ink and published in volumes that were bound in the same colors. And basically gave you all the doctrines that staff need to comply with, as well as Scientologists. So the defense of anything is untenable. The only way to defend anything is to attack. And if you ever forget that, you'll lose every battle you are ever engaged in, whether it is in terms of personal conversation, public debate, or a court of law. Never be interested in charges. Do yourself much more charging, and you will win. And you see this tactic used all the time. Rather than rather than defend against an actual charge, there's always a new charge against the person who's making the attack, even if it's an ex-Scientologist who was the #2 person in the organization for a 30-year period. It's the same response. The purpose of the lawsuit is to harass and discourage rather than to win. The law can be used very easily to harass, and enough harassment on somebody is simply on the thin edge anyway, will be generally sufficient to cause his professional decease. If possible, of course, ruin him utterly. And then enemy, SP, or suppressive person, order, fair game, may be deprived of property or injured by any means by any Scientologist without any discipline of the Scientologist, may be tricked, sued, or lied to, or destroyed. Now this is that for some reason has given Scientology a bad rap. So in response to that, if you ask a Scientologist today, what's with the fair game policy, isn't that kind of an unethical thing for a religious organization to do? Their response will be that the fair game policy order was canceled. There is indeed a Hubbard policy letter that is titled The Cancellation of Fair Game. Within that policy, it says, this policy letter does not cancel any policy on the treatment or handling of an SP. So really, it's another case of let's change the name and just forget that existed, but policy is still in effect. So Hubbard was in hiding, mostly in California, and he died in an RV on this ranch in Creston, California, which is still a church property today. This logo here is the logo of a corporation called the Church of Spiritual Technology, and that's the corporation that's tasked with preserving the works of L. Ron Hubbard for eternity. So there are various places on the earth where you see this symbol, and there are vaults underneath where his works are buried. So before Hubbard died, he used something that he had actually created in the Sea Org as a layer of protection between himself and the church organizations. And back when he was on the ship, he created something called the Commodore's Messenger Organization, which was mostly young adolescent girls who would speak on behalf of L. Ron Hubbard to deliver his orders to various people on the ship, get responses and bring them back. And they would actually do things like imitating his manner of speaking and try to make sure that they repeated his words exactly. So they ended up in effect, exercising power on behalf of Hubbard, and many of them enjoyed that. And several of them ended up as continuing to be this layer of insulation between Hubbard and the operation of the church. The main three people were Pat and Annie Broker, who were a married couple. It was Annie Tidman that was in the Apollo Stars album cover. And her husband, Pat, and this gentleman here, David Miscavige, who is the current head of the Church of Scientology. Now, when Mary Sue Hubbard went to prison, Miscavige essentially pushed her out at that point, or actually before she went to jail. And he slowly was accumulating power within the organization. Really going back at least to 1979, when he created something called the Watchdog Committee, which was a response to the arrests in the criminal cases. The Watchdog Committee was supposed to be a reform organization to clean up Scientology, get rid of those guardians office people, and take control. And Miscavige really was the key player in the Watchdog Committee. In 1982, there was an event. Actually, let me come to that in a moment. So Pat and Annie Broker were spending their time with Hubbard, so they were really taking care of Hubbard, and they had all of Hubbard's documents when he died. Miscavige was taking care of the organization on the organization side and was making preparations for seizing power. But after Hubbard died, there was a big event where all Scientologists were invited to come to the Hollywood Palladium. And Miscavige was the master of ceremonies, and at that event he announced that L. Ron Hubbard has dropped the body to pursue his next set of studies in a more unrestrained environment with his Thetan flying free. And at that event, patent ante broker were elevated to the position called loyal officer, which the implication to most people there was, oh, patent ante broker are the successors for control of the Scientology organization. But Miscavige had other plans, and he ended up basically taking control of the organization and ousting them. And the way that he got control of Hubbard's papers was that he set up a meeting with the brokers in Washington, D.C. They flew out. He had 20 people that were back at the ranch in California, and they phoned the ranch caretaker and said, the FBI is going to be raiding the ranch within 2 hours. If we don't get Hubbard's documents out now, they may be lost forever. And so the caretaker said, okay, take them. And Miscavige got control of the documents. We know now that starting in 1988, patent ante broker were followed full-time by private investigators hired by the Church of Scientology. There were only 2 people in the Church of Scientology who knew about it, David Miscavige and the number 2, Marty Rathbun. But these private investigators were being paid $500,000 a year by Scientology to keep tabs on the brokers and make sure they didn't do anything to try to interfere with Scientology. The main reason we know about those payments is because Scientology stopped making those payments in the summer of last year, and the private investigators filed a breach of contract lawsuit in Texas against Scientology. All right. So another important thing is that in Scientology there are orgs, which are sort of the corporate stores, and missions, which are the franchises. Missions can deliver lower-level courses, and orgs, if they're advanced orgs, can deliver the high-level courses. Some of these missions were incredibly successful, including the Santa Barbara mission that I mentioned earlier, that was David Mayo's organization. In 1982, Miscavige saw how much money they were making, and he unilaterally imposed a new contract on the mission holders that said, you're going to have to start delivering a higher percentage of your revenue to the Church of Scientology if you want to continue delivering your teachings. So that prompted a number of people to say, well, screw you, we're going to go off and create our own thing independently of the church, which ultimately became what's called the free zone. So a number of Scientologists in Germany and other locations created something called the free zone, which was delivering Scientology teachings quietly in the background. The ones who were more visible, like the Advanced Ability Center of David Mayo, ended up getting harassed and sued into oblivion and shut down. This is actually a Google Maps picture of Gilman Hot Springs, California, which is Scientology's international headquarters, also known as Gold Base. And this is where the hole is that I mentioned earlier. This is where videotapes, tapes, DVDs, and so forth are produced. It's where the senior officers in the Sea Org live. It's where David Miscavige lives. And there are some very interesting stories that have come out about people who have escaped from here. It is, although it's a public highway that runs down the middle, there are fences with razor wire on both sides. There are guard stations with armed guards. And things are fairly well controlled, and you need a pass to get out. The Hole is a location where a number of senior executives in the church have said that they were kept in this office building. Actually, the next picture. Yeah, this is the Hole. It was a set of offices. It's really sort of 2 double-wide trailers. Bars were put on the doors and windows at one point briefly. But some executives report being kept there as long as 5 years on a 24/7 basis. Mike Rinder, who is another number 2, head of the Office of Special Affairs, estimates that he spent 2 years in this building between 2006 and 2007. There was an expose on what was going on here in the Tampa Bay Times in 2009. after which apparently conditions were improved and no one was forced to stay overnight there any longer. 1991 probably marks in hindsight, probably marks the peak of Scientology's size and power. And this article came out in May of 1991 by Richard Behar, Scientology, the Cult of Greed, which led to a decade-long lawsuit by the Church of Scientology against Time Magazine. Time Magazine was ultimately entirely successful and on all counts. But this was a second big hit in 2 years. The prior one in 1990 was a five-year investigation by two investigative reporters for the Los Angeles Times, Joel Sapel and Robert Welkos, called The Scientology Story, that was published over a 6-day period in 1990. This 1991 story, one of the interesting things about it is that the Scientology secrets showed up in a case that's related to the magazine story. So there was an ex-Scientologist by the name of Steve Fishman, not a particularly reliable source, but he had a lawsuit against Scientology, or he was being sued by Scientology, and one of the things he did to defend himself was he took these Scientology secrets and entered them into evidence in his case. What Scientology did to keep those court documents from being made public is they had a Scientologist show up at the court building every morning, be the person first in line to check those documents out, keep them checked out from the court all day long, and then check them back in at the end of the day. And that was successful for almost 2 years until the Washington Post got a hold of them and published some excerpts in 1995, at which time the court agreed to seal the remaining documents. But another thing that happened in 1991 was a news group on Usenet was created called Alt Religion Scientology. The alt news groups were alt means alternative. There were sort of mainstream news groups that were often controlled and moderated, and then there were these alt news groups which were kind of a free-for-all, and the first three created were called alt.sex, alt.drugs, and alt.rock'n'roll, with alt.religion Scientology following a few years later. It was actually created as a joke by a graduate student named Scott Gehring, and he actually forged the name of David Miscavige on the news group creation message. So the group appeared to have been created by a person named David Miscavige. And nothing exciting really happened on that news group for a while, except that in the early 90s, some of the people from the Free Zone started discovering it and using it to talk amongst themselves. And then Scientology discovered it in 1994. And another case where the print is a little bit too small, but this email was actually posted on the news group. The news groups were kind of a distributed bulletin board system. So there were lots of servers worldwide where the same sets of messages were circulated throughout. But this memo is a briefing to all Scientologists on the internet, and it basically says, as you know, there's been quite a bit of false and derogatory information going out over the internet by a few detractors and squirrels, etc. Church has fired up a project to collect all this information, and we've been in common with some of you already. We have a plan of action that we're taking to out-create the Entheta. Entheta is basically bad stuff about Scientology. On these news groups, Alt Religion Scientology and Alt Clearing Technology, that news group was another Free Zone news group. And get positive information to the general public. Basically, as a group, we will no longer put up with our religion being criticized, harassed, and denigrated on the internet. If you can imagine 40 to 50 Scientologists posting on the internet every few days, we'll just run the SPs right off the system. It will be quite simple, actually. The internet doesn't work that way. Yeah, in fact, this was leaked, I think, within about 2 months. This was leaked and posted. But Scientology started sending people out to visit some of the more prominent critics who were ex-Scientologists. and basically warning them that they were in legal danger and they needed to get right with Scientology. They also, as part of their plans, they distributed some kits to Scientologists in good standing for use with the internet. And these kits were designed to help the Scientologists create pro-Scientology web pages to counteract anti-Scientology web pages. But they also included a piece of filtering software, which was a version of Net Nanny, I believe. But that filtering software was designed to block access to anything critical of Scientology. And one of the things that I'm most proud of in my life is that my name was on the list of things that Scientologists weren't allowed to access on the internet. And actually, this was shortly before this is when I first started getting into this stuff, and it was more out of a civil liberties, let's defend the internet was really my primary motivator here. So Scientology actually took steps to try to delete the news group, to try to delete postings by critics. But then the Scientology secrets started getting posted anonymously to the news group. And a couple of ex-Scientologists started commenting on those secrets to explain what all this stuff meant. And that led to Scientology raiding the homes, first of Dennis Ehrlich, who was an ex-Scientologist, OT8 out of Glendale, California. They raided his home basically using the copyright and trade secret statutes. So essentially the same kind of thing that would be used in an anti-piracy raid on a pirate video operation. But they came in, they took his computers, his hard drives, his floppy drives, physical documents that mentioned Scientology, and so forth. Subsequently, the same thing happened to Arnie Lerma in Virginia, just outside of D.C. The lawsuits in both cases named the individuals, they named the ISPs, and in the case of Lerma's case, also named the Washington Post and 2 reporters. So picketing began. Because Scientology was trying to suppress criticism on the internet, people started picketing their local churches of Scientology. And it was on a relatively small scale, but we did get some press here and there. That's me back a long time ago. And I don't know if you can read the sign, but it says "Stop the Cancel Poodle," which in hindsight was probably not the best way to get the general public excited about this. But the other side, I think, had something a little bit more generic. But we did get some press in the Scottsdale Tribune, and we also got private investigators coming after us. So this guy was the Church of Scientology's main private investigator. He was an ex-LAPD detective named Gene Ingram. He got kicked off the force for activity having to do with tipping off drug dealers and running a prostitution ring, for which he was never prosecuted for either of those things. But when he came to Phoenix, we found that he had warrants out for his arrest in Washington State and Tampa, Florida, both for some form of impersonation. The Tampa one was for impersonating a police officer. Washington was criminal impersonation. He also had a concealed weapon violation in Oklahoma. But the result of finding those warrants was that his private investigator license expired in Arizona, and he was unable to renew it. So other PIs had to be hired. So these guys, I think, came out of LA. They showed up and were taking pictures of the people that were picketing, as well as pictures of license plates of cars in the parking lot. So we took their pictures and put them up on a web page. Didn't actually identify them. This guy, Bruce Pettigrew, was a member of the Humanist Society of Greater Phoenix and was one of the more long-term picketers. And the reason he has a piece of tape over his mouth there is because they did use a legal process against him. They got a temporary restraining order against him by claiming that he had been shouting and disrupting Sunday services. And I was at the hearing, and due to the way the hearing went, he wasn't able to rebut their claim that they have Sunday services. The judge was clearly under the impression that, oh, there's a congregation in pews on Sunday morning that are being disrupted. Well, first of all, he wasn't shouting, and second of all, there are no Sunday services to be disrupted. Scientology is really a one-on-one auditing relationship, more like going in for therapy. This woman here, can't really see in the picture, but this woman is the head of the Office of Special Affairs for this Mesa, Arizona org, and she's pointing at me saying, don't stop or you'll be sued. Okay, OT7. It became a badge of honor for people on the internet to get a lawsuit threat from the Church of Scientology. And the easiest way to do that was to post these two lines, which many people put into their signatures of every post. So it says, find some plants, trees, etc., and communicate to them individually until you know they have received your communication. So first half's easy, second half's a little more difficult. Go to a zoo or a place with many types of life and communicate with each of them until you know the communication is received and, if possible, returned. So a little Dr. Dolittle action there. Yeah, so this was amusing. It was a quick way to get 50 points on the scale for lawsuit threats. And the lawsuit threats would come in email either from a lawyer named Helena Coburn, which were known as Coburn-grams, or from an attorney known as Ava Paquette, and those were known as Avagrams. So getting a Coburn-gram or an Avagram was a badge of honor. But before the end of 1995, the judge in Arnie Lerma's case had basically come to a decision on the case. The case against the Washington Post was tossed out of court. The trade secret claims were tossed out of court. The ruling was basically if your trade secrets are posted all over the internet, they are no longer secrets. But the copyrights were upheld. So taking large amounts of information from the Church of Scientology and reposting it verbatim is a copyright infringement. So Arnie Lerma was found liable and ordered to pay damages of $2,500 for 5 instances of non-willful infringement, which is getting off with a slap on the wrist compared to what happens with the RIAA and the MPAA. So things kind of died down for a while until the Lisa McPherson case became public, which happened in '97. Now you see, she died in the care of Scientology at the end of 1995, but no one made the connection between her death and Scientology until almost 2 years later. And the main person who discovered that and made it public was my co-author for my earlier article in Skeptic magazine, Jeff Jacobson. And he heard about it from a detective with the Tampa police, and then started asking questions about it online, which led to a series of stories in the newspapers, which started digging up the details. And the details behind the scenes didn't come out until just a couple of years ago. The best account of that is in Janet Reitman's book, Inside Scientology, which reports on what exactly happened to her. But essentially, she died in their care while under the baby watch, which is the treatment for psychotic break, and was found to have bug bites all over her body and be dehydrated. She was taken to, and declared dead on arrival, she was taken to a hospital that was not the closest or the second closest or the third closest hospital to the Fort Harrison Hotel. It was the fourth closest hospital. And the reason she was taken there was because there was a Scientologist as an MD on the ER staff at that hospital. But this led to criminal charges against the Church of Scientology in Clearwater, and it led to a civil suit from her family. The criminal charges ended up being dropped when the medical examiner changed her report from saying undetermined to accidental death. And then the civil suit, that kind of took the wind out of the sails of the civil suit, but it was settled with terms undisclosed. And then something called the Lisa McPherson Trust was set up in 1999 in Clearwater by a multimillionaire who learned about all this stuff online and decided to become active. That lasted for about 2 years and was basically taking things to the streets in Clearwater, where Scientology is very active. But that multimillionaire kind of found himself in an awkward position with Scientology and ended up having to shut everything down. And then things really did quiet down online from about 2003, 2004, up until 2008. And I kind of characterized the part that came before, starting in the early 90s, was Scientology's war on the internet. In 2008, it was the internet's war on Scientology. And what happened was that there was a video that Tom Cruise made for an event, a Scientology event, that ended up getting posted to the internet years later, in 2008. And Scientology started going after the people who were posting the video. Gawker Media got a hold of it and put it up on their website. Scientology said, take it down or we'll sue you. And Gawker said, go right ahead, we're not taking it down. And Anonymous, which is, I'm not going to go into the history of Anonymous, but I can give you pointers to getting that history if you want it. But Anonymous declared war on Scientology, created something called Project Chanology, and started organizing protests. And where the picketing that we did in the mid-90s, I think at its peak we had maybe a couple hundred people worldwide picketing churches of Scientology. The February 10th, 2008 protests by Anonymous had more than 7,000 people worldwide picketing their local churches of Scientology wearing Guy Fawkes masks. And subsequently, there have been accelerating defections. This woman, Tori Kreisman, was an active public Scientologist who also did some volunteer work for the project to combat critics on the internet. She made the mistake of actually interacting with critics one-on-one, and her interactions with Andreas Heldal Lund, who's a critic in Norway who runs Xenu.net, she decided that he seemed like a nice guy and he had some valid points, and that there really were free speech implications of what was going on. And she ended up deciding that she had to leave the Church of Scientology. In 2005, South Park's episode Trapped in the Closet aired, and basically had a little animated story of Xenu with the little caption, "This is what Scientologists actually believe," similar to their takedown of the Mormon religion. We now know, as of the end of 2011, that Scientology was very unhappy about this, hired private investigators to go after Trey Parker and Matt Stone, go after their friends, find out who their friends are, try to dig up any dirt they could on them, but nothing actually ever came of that. I mean, they did find out who their friends were and try to dig up dirt, but they really couldn't find anything to use. In 2006, Janet Reitman's Rolling Stone article, Inside Scientology, came out. This is notable because it's one of the most prominent critiques of Scientology in a major publication that didn't lead to a lawsuit. And then ultimately she turned this into a book that came out in 2010. It's by far the best introduction to history of Scientology that kind of brings things up to date as of 2010, although a huge amount has happened since then. This guy is Marty Rathbun. He was the number 2 in Scientology under David Miscavige up until 2005 when he left. His title was Inspector General of the Religious Technology Center. He was Tom Cruise's auditor. When Tom Cruise was drifting away from Scientology while he was married to Nicole Kidman, it was his job to get Tom Cruise back in the fold. And he's also a source of information on the private investigators that I mentioned earlier. And he's been speaking out since 2009. He came out with this book just late last year called The Scientology Reformation. He kind of thinks of himself as the Martin Luther of Scientology. So he still believes in Scientology doctrines and thinks that Hubbard is great, but doesn't like the organization. Joel Sapel, one of the authors of the 1990 Los Angeles Times stories, just did a story last month in Los Angeles Magazine looking back at what happened when he was investigating his piece and the kind of harassment that he was subject to back then. And kind of the cornerstone of this retrospective was that he had the chance to go interview Marty Rathbun, who was the guy on the other side back then. And he referred to Rathbun as a reluctant whistleblower, and it's a very fascinating story. You can really see the cognitive dissonance in there, as Rathbun doesn't want to take responsibility for some of the bad stuff that happened, and outright denies that some of the bad things happened. There were a number of cases of people back in the late 70s, early 80s, where critics had their pets die. A judge in a Scientology case, his dog was drowned. And Joel Sapel's dog just suddenly started having seizures and had apparently been poisoned and had to be put down. He's always suspected Scientology, but has never been able to prove it. And when he pressed Rathbun on it, Rathbun just denied it outright that Scientology would do anything like that. But then later on, he said things, well, maybe I wouldn't put it past him to do stuff like that. So very, very kind of mixed message from Rathbun on that one. Some other people who have departed recently. Jeff Hawkins was a Sea Org executive in charge of marketing for the Church of Scientology. It was his campaign in the 1980s with the exploding volcano television commercials that actually put Dianetics back on the bestseller lists. And he's also been he wrote a story of his time in Scientology called Counterfeit Dreams, which he originally published as a series of blog posts. So you can read the whole story on his blog. It's very well written. It's one of the better books by an ex-Scientologist that tells their story. He's also a good source of information about how big is the Church of Scientology really, how big was it when you were in charge of marketing. Amy Scobie worked in leadership at the Celebrity Center. She reported directly to David Miscavige and also worked at that INT base. She joined Scientology back in when she was 14 years old and left in 2005. She's also noteworthy because she's the niece of Dick Scobie, who was killed in the 1986 Challenger explosion. And she was actually unable to attend her uncle's funeral because of Scientology. And then this guy, Mike Rinder, during the time that all the online stuff was going on in the mid-90s, he was chief bad guy. He was head of the Office of Special Affairs. And he was also prominent in the media up until, actually you could see him in the 2007 Panorama BBC segment, Scientology and Me by John Sweeney. And he looks kind of thin on that when he appears in that program. And what he says now that he's out, is he had been in the hole before that time and living on a diet of beans and rice and running around and so forth. So he had become very thin as a result of that. Looks a little healthier now. And he has been speaking out since 2009. And he, like Rathbun, is an advocate of independent Scientology, practicing Scientology outside of the authority of the church. Now we get some more interesting ones. Jenna Miscavige Hill, who's the niece of David Miscavige. Her parents got out back in 2000, and then she just got out in 2005. She co-founded an organization called ex-Scientologykids.org that has a website and an online forum to help kids get out of Scientology. And she has a book that is coming out on February 7th called Beyond Belief, My Secret Life Inside Scientology and My Harrowing Escape. The next one, John Brousseau, was at one time David Miscavige's brother-in-law. And he spent 32 years in the Sea Org, just started speaking out last year. He did a lot of work for celebrity Scientologists. He was kind of both a handyman and able to do things like car customization. So he did a custom SUV for Tom Cruise. Ron Miscavige Sr., David Miscavige's father, just left in the summer of 2012. And then L. Ron Hubbard's granddaughter also left last year. Some celebrities who have departed. Jason Begay, who was in for many years, left very unhappy in 2007 and in a noisy manner, started making YouTube videos about his experience and trying to get other celebrities to get out. He's probably best known for being in G.I. Jane with Demi Moore, and he has a recurring guest role on Californication with David Duchovny. This guy here is Paul Haggis, Oscar-winning director of Crash. He left after 35 years because apparently he never came across the anti-homosexuality aspects of Scientology. I don't know how that's possible, but the thing that really upset him was Scientology's support of Proposition 8 in California. And his story was told in a 2011 New Yorker story called The Apostate by Lawrence Wright. Lawrence Wright started turning that into a book, initially about Paul Haggis, that ended up being a lot more about Tom Cruise and the other issues in the church. That book just came out 2 days ago, called Going Clear. And I'll say a little bit more about what Scientology has done in response to that. But the other woman here, her name is Nazanin Boniadi, and she's a Scientology OT8 who also just got out and has not been speaking out publicly, but her story was just told in the September issue of Vanity Fair last year. She was the person who was selected by Scientology to be the next Mrs. Tom Cruise prior to Katie Holmes, and she spent 3 months living with him, but she did not get along with David Miscavige, which is an essential requirement for Mrs. Tom Cruise, and so she was let go. The Scientology actually broke up on Tom Cruise's behalf with her. Another celebrity who has clearly left, although hasn't really spoken out publicly aside from writing a song about it, is Lisa Marie Presley. Her latest album has a song with some lyrics that are pretty clearly criticizing the Church of Scientology. And sorry, it's even too unclear for me to read, but it's lines along the lines of fair weather friends and counterfeit religion and things like that. This woman has probably been more damaging than anyone else in the last slightly more than a year. Debbie Cook, she was the face of the flag service organization for the Sea Org. So she was in a lot of recruiting videos for the Sea Org that were used internally in Scientology. She's been out for a while, or she's been out of the Sea Org for a while, but was still a Scientologist in good standing when she sent an email on December 31st of 2011 to 12,000 Scientologists that are still in the church, which might be almost all of them, as I'll point out shortly. And Scientology's response was to sue her 27 days later for violating a confidentiality agreement, since she had been a former Sea Org employee. That's the fastest, it ended up being one of the fastest settlements of a lawsuit I've ever seen with Scientology. Usually they like the cases to drag on for a long time and be very painful. She was sued on January 27th. It was settled in April, shortly after she gave testimony in open court in Texas, in which she basically talked about physical abuse, talked about what was going on in the hole, and then it was going to be Scientology's turn to testify, and they apparently decided they did not want to do so. So her letter was really aimed at Scientologists that are inside, that believe in Scientology. So she was basically quoting chapter and verse from Hubbard policy letters about how current Scientology practices for collecting funds are contrary to policy. This guy is was head of the mission in Haifa, Israel. It's the largest mission in Israel. He took the entire mission and said, "We're leaving the Church of Scientology and we're going independent." All right. So, as I wrap up, there's counter evidence to all these departures, and Scientology has been opening ideal orgs, what they call ideal orgs, which is basically paying cash for a piece of property in prime real estate in major cities across the United States. They've opened 34 of them since 2003, and they say they've got 60 more that are in process. And just a few days ago, you may have seen The Atlantic had an advertorial from Scientology about how Scientology is growing and opening all these ideal orgs, and they had about a dozen of them that they showed the pictures, including this one that just opened in July in Phoenix. That advertorial, they paid $50,000 to the Atlantic for that. Huge backlash against the Atlantic. They pulled the advertising. It's another case of Scientology kind of doing something that totally backfires on them. But the timing suggests that they were trying to distract from two things that also happened in the last week. One was Nancy Manny is an ex-Scientologist who used to be with the Guardian office, who worked as a spy for Scientology and also ran the Celebrity Center. She wrote a tell-all book that came out a few years ago, which was just turned into an hour-long documentary on the Investigation Discovery Channel, which just aired on Thursday night. And then Lawrence Wright's book, Going Clear, which just came out 2 days ago. So, but if you looked at the Atlantic advertorial, the first link on the upper right was actually a short review of Lawrence Wright's book. So it was a good move. So these ideal orgs have been opening, and they are paying cash for them. They are nice properties. I compared, this is the new facility and the old facility. I thought maybe because the old facility is a 3-story and the new one's 2-story, maybe they downsized a little bit. No, they didn't. The square footage of the new facility is about twice the square footage of the old one. The old building was a $1.9 million building. The new building is a $5.8 million set of buildings. Basically what they're doing is they're getting Scientologists in the local areas to contribute cash so that they can buy these with cash. And they say we need more than the purchase price because we also have to be able to maintain it. Once the building is bought, then they don't open it for a while. They say, oh, well, now we need more money for refurbishing it. It's kind of like what they're doing with the Superpower building on a smaller but more distributed scale. So the Superpower building has been sitting there for close to a decade without opening, and they keep collecting more money, even though they've raised at least 140 million, some say over 200 million, for that building. They're basically just using it as a way to generate cash. So they're really collecting a lot more money than they need for each of these ideal orgs, and they're getting some pretty nice buildings. So this is St. Louis. It's a former Masonic temple. They also bought a former Masonic temple in Santa Ana, California. But once they buy these buildings, the title goes to Church of Scientology International, and the local org then has to pay rent to Scientology for the facility. And a lot of the critics are saying that the facilities are really unnecessary for the number of Scientologists that they have. So they've started calling them, instead of calling them ideal orgs, they're calling them idle morgues. So what evidence do we have about Scientology membership? Well, they've claimed for many years that there are 8 million Scientologists. That number has been essentially unchanged for a long time. But at one point, the guy who was president of Church of Scientology International, Heber Jench, admitted that number counts everyone who has ever bought a book by L. Ron Hubbard. It includes anyone who has ever taken a free personality test at a Church of Scientology. It includes anyone who has ever asked for information about Scientology. And by the way, once you get on the mailing list, you do not get off the mailing list. So be warned about that. Some other evidence that we do have is that they used to report how many courses were completed by Scientologists. So in 1989, there were 11,000. By 97, it had dropped to slightly more than half that. And they don't report that anymore. They used to report how many new people became clear per year. In the 1980s, it was in the thousands. It ranged between 2,700 and 5,600. In the 90s, it ranged from 0 to 3,500, and the last time they reported them was in 1996, and there were only 224 in that year. And then the American Religious Identification Survey, which is a poll of religious self-identification in the United States. In 2001, the count for Scientologists was 55,000. In 2008, it was down to 25,000. Although you have to take that with a grain of salt because the margin of error is so high that that it almost swamps that difference between them. Jeff Hawkins, the marketing guy that I mentioned earlier, he estimates that the peak number of Scientologists was in 1991 and was somewhere between 40 and 50,000 worldwide. I've seen some estimates. I'm not sure how much credence to give them, but current estimates range from 12,000 to 20,000 worldwide, with possibly under 10,000 in the U.S. One estimate says about 6,000 people on staff globally, and about 3,000 non-staff outside the U.S. and 3,000 inside the U.S. It's notable that the major Los Angeles events are held at the Shrine Auditorium, which has a capacity of 6,000. They haven't needed a larger facility. In Clearwater, Florida, they use Ruth Eckerd Hall, which has a capacity of 1,200. They haven't needed a larger hall. So there's some indirect evidence. Those are the two largest locations for Scientologists. And then the last item here, there's a wiki page from Why We Protest of ex-Scientologists who are not just ex-Scientologists, but are ex-Scientologists who are speaking out publicly. That list just went over 2,000 names at the end of October of this year. So that's a pretty high percentage of the peak total. So in conclusion, I think that there's been a clear decline in the Church of Scientology, both in terms of the things that we can measure and some of the more qualitative things like how actively they go after their critics and what happens to them. And I think independent Scientology has really been a key factor in the decline. So they were the source of exposing the secrets. The rise of the internet has allowed these ex-members to get in touch with each other and to allow people that are still inside to obtain mutual knowledge that there are other people that have problems and what those problems are. And now there's a critical mass of people who are still Scientologists but are outside the church, so that there's kind of a you don't have to worry about complete disconnection and abandoning everything. You kind of have a way station or a halfway house that you can try out on your way out. And I think probably most people who do make it halfway out do end up subsequently going all the way out. But ironically, it may be that Scientology's inability to control information about itself as a result of both the internet and independent Scientology may actually make it more persistent in the long run, because now it can adapt, and it may be the closest competition to Scientology may end up being what survives. But Scientology does have a long way to go before it's going to collapse. There are rumors that their cash reserves are in excess of $1 billion, which will last quite a while. But they've been reaching out to new markets as well. So one thing that's happened is they've really been reaching out to African Americans and have been teaming up with the Nation of Islam, which is another kind of UFO cult organization. They found that they have some commonality, and in 2010, Louis Farrakhan had a bunch of his members of Nation of Islam come to headquarters for training in Dianetics, and he encouraged all of them to obtain auditor certification in 2010. Some more recent things have been happening with Scientology and Nation of Islam working hand in hand, including with they sort of took over a charter school in Dunedin, Florida, and drained it of cash, and it has filed for bankruptcy, and there's been some stories on that lately. So then finally, I just wanted to point out a few of Scientology's organizations. On the left side are the things that are officially Scientology organizations. So the Religious Technology Center controls their copyrights. The Church of Scientology or International is the main delivery organization. Author Services manages Hubbard's copyrights on his non-Scientology material. Church of Spiritual Technology is preserving his works. Bridge Publications is the publishing arm. Golden Era Productions does their videos. But then on this side are Scientology front groups that are not so outspoken about the Scientology connection, so it's good to know about these. Citizens Commission on Human Rights is an organization designed to combat abuses by psychiatry. They operate a museum in Los Angeles that's just a bunch of attacks on psychiatry. That organization has offices throughout the country. The office in Arizona got some legislators in the Arizona legislature to sponsor a bill on their behalf. Ended up dying, but it was interesting. The attempt was certainly interesting. The Association for Better Living and Education has a number of subsidiary groups. Applied Scholastics, trying to get Hubbard technology into public schools. Criminon, a prison ministry. Narconon, the drug treatment program, which has been having some serious problems in Oklahoma with some people dying there. The Way to Happiness Foundation. The World Literacy Crusade was really how the Nation of Islam got pulled in. The World Literacy Crusade was run by a former Baptist minister named Alfredi Johnson, and he ended up befriending Louis Farrakhan and pulling those guys in. The Volunteer Ministers Association, these are guys that wear little yellow jackets and go to disaster scenes to help people by doing touch assists. They showed up at Ground Zero in New York City. The Drug-Free Marshals is kind of Scientology's version of the DARE program. And then Citizens for an Alternative Tax System, kind of a fair tax kind of organization. So they're trying to reach out into some political areas as well. And just some resources. Online, the best way to stay up to date with what's going on like right now is Tony Ortega's blog, tonyortega.org, former editor of the Village Voice, who's now working on a book on Scientology. He's probably done more than anyone to report on a day-to-day basis what's happening inside Scientology. Xenu.net is a great source of Scientology's secrets if you want to know more details. Dave Turetsky's Secrets of Scientology page. He's a computer science professor at Carnegie Mellon who has a good page on that. And if you want more information on Anonymous in Scientology, Jeff Jacobson has an article called We Are Legion online that is a good recounting of that. And then book-wise, Janet Reitman's book, I can't recommend that highly enough, Inside Scientology. Jeff Hawkins' book I already mentioned. John Atak's book, before Reitman's book, was the best introduction to Scientology from a critical point of view. And then Russell Miller's Barefaced Messiah is the best biography of L. Ron Hubbard. I haven't put Lawrence Wright's Going Clear up there yet because I haven't read it yet, but I'm sure it will get on that list. From what I hear, it's very, very good and brings things up for the last 2 years. So at that point, I will take any questions. Lots of hands. Thank you. Gentleman in the front.
From top to bottom in the organization, given whatever amount of knowledge people have about the discipline, how much do they actually believe, and how much of it is scamming? How much of it is for personal finance, for power, for whatever, or just the feeling of a cult and being in it versus actually belief in the discipline? And how do they get past telling people about Xenu and Thetans and not having them having their heads explode and run out the door?
Well, that apparently happens. But my opinion, based on the Scientologists I've interacted with and the ex-Scientologists I've interacted with, is that far and away most of them are sincere believers. I haven't met one yet that I think was a scammer or that gave the opinion that it was being run by scammers. They do think that Miscavige is kind of twisting the word of Hubbard and using it for personal gain. And certainly some of the things that he's done are pretty beyond the pale. So like the works of L. Ron Hubbard keep getting reissued every so often with corrections, and all Scientologists are expected to buy the full set of works again all over again. And then how do people get in? That really varies. The front groups will all try to get people in. So drug rehabilitation is one common way. The celebrity centers have actually helped up-and-comers in Hollywood make connections and become successful in their careers. So, and I think it's unquestionable that most of the people who are involved with Scientology and stay with it, feel like they've gotten some kind of benefit out of it. Whether that's with the early courses are things like the communications course, how to communicate effectively with other people. So it's a little more commonsensical kind of stuff, and you don't. There are definitely a lot of Scientologists who get to clear and don't even get to the OT level, so they never see OT3. And as I mentioned before, you have to put a lot of time and money into it before you get to that level.
What have been your direct encounters or indirect encounters with Scientology?
I worked in the security organization of a national ISP when a lot of the stuff I talked about early on was going on, and some of the people who got sued ended up becoming customers of the ISP that I worked for. And we did receive a few Digital Millennium Copyright Act notices from the Church of Scientology. I picketed, as I mentioned, which was mainly, it was just personal on for civil liberties reasons. And as a result of that, the worst thing that Scientology has ever done to me, I've never been harassed, but I did get invited to lunch with the head of the Office of Special Affairs in Mesa, Arizona. I went to lunch, she bought. We had a good conversation, although the conversation went something like this. What can we do to get you to stop picketing the Church of Scientology? My answer was something to the effect of, stop trying to suppress criticism on the internet. And I kept picketing, and she was no longer in that position shortly thereafter. And then it became the woman who was pointing at me saying that we're going to sue you. So they went with more of a hard-ass approach. But in some of the picketing, I got a chance to interact with sometimes Scientologists would come out of the orgs and talk to us if they were sufficiently high enough level. So I've talked to some OT7s and OT8s. And I've talked to a lot of more X's than people that are actively in. The last time I gave this talk in Phoenix, a gentleman showed up who just left last summer after more than 30 years in Scientology. He was with Hubbard on the ships in the 60s. He was a Sea Org executive for 17 years. And he was a friend of David Miscavige's father and got out at the same time he did. So it's very interesting, the level of people that are leaving these days and willing to talk about it.
I was just wondering, you talked about a lot of events where people have sort of fought back in different ways or kind of exposed the organization in different ways. What do you think has had the biggest impact in making, either kind of bringing down Scientology somewhat or making it look less appealing to the public?
Well, I think it's really two things, and it's the two things that were in my conclusion. So one is the internet and the fact that when the critics in the mid-90s who were all engaging in online criticism, they basically assembled all these things into web pages and preserved this information. So that essentially what happened was all this stuff got put together by people who are now the older folks online, and the new kids starting in 2008 rediscovered all that same old material and put the same material to new use. So I think that's one key aspect. Certainly the investigative reporting by the Los Angeles Times and the Washington Post and others, Time Magazine, have done a lot to expose things and get them into broadcast media. Television has definitely been very effective. There's been a lot more on television in the last 5 years than previously. And I think there's a lot less fear by journalists and by the media of the Church of Scientology. So that and the fact that there's this kind of critical mass of independent Scientologists that are on the outside now, and they seem more like you expect a religion to behave rather than a cult.
Yeah, I think we would have right now.